So I'd like to introduce the moderator of our first panel, which is called Development and Aid, Looking Back and Looking Forward. This panel, I'm very pleased to say, was organized by the Institute for the Study of International Development, and it will be chaired by the Institute's founding director, Philip Oxhorn. He is a professor of political science at McGill, as I said, founding director of the Institute, as well as the editor-in-chief of the international journal Latin American Research Review. His own research focuses on the comparative study of civil society and its role in supporting democratic regimes, particularly in Latin America. So I invite you, Phil, to come to the stage.
Thanks, Will. It's really a pleasure for me to be here. You know, my institute has always supported MISC and vice versa, but finally at the end of Will's tenure as director, we're actually collaborating, even if it's in a small way, with this panel. The timing couldn't be better. I mean, this is International Development Week, so we need to be thinking about this, but even more than this week, if we think about the last 6 months, climate change agreements, the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals. We all know what's going on in the Middle East. It's a perfect time to reassess Canada's role in the world. The timing couldn't be better from that perspective. Plus, there was an election and a new government. So there's never a better opportunity to consider these compelling and very urgent issues in a systematic way. To begin to start the discussion, I'm very proud to be able to introduce to you our panel, Charles Bassett, Julia Sanchez, and Ian Smillie. Would you like them to come up, set up here, and then I'll introduce each one as they're ready to give their few words. So Charles, and I think I'm supposed to sit here as the moderator. So we'll start with you and we'll go backwards. Okay. Julia. Great. So our first speaker will be Charles Bassett. Charles Bassett has had an almost 40-year career with the Canadian Public Service. He joined in the Public Service in 1968, and in 1976 he moved to CEDA. At CEDA, he occupied a number of senior positions, including Vice President Africa Branch, Vice President Corporate Affairs, Vice President Central and Eastern Europe Branch, and finally Senior Vice President. He was also Canadian Ambassador to Angola and Mozambique and High Commissioner to Botswana and Zimbabwe. At the end of his term at CEDA, he was appointed Canadian Executive Director to the Inter-American Development Bank in Washington, D.C. Post-retirement, he's been a member of the board of the Foundation for International Training, and I'm very proud to say, one of our original members on the advisory board for the McGill Institute for the Study of International Development. So I'll turn the floor over to Charles.
Thank you, Phil. Je vais faire ma présentation en anglais, mais si vous avez des questions en français, ça me ferait plaisir d'y répondre en français. My little attempt there not to be the first speaker was because I'm going to talk about the future, and one of my colleagues is going to talk more about the past. So you're going to have to work in reverse today, okay? In the 30 years that I worked in international development, there have been all sorts of different trends, different approaches, many different priorities. You mention any one of them, from integrated rural development or trickle-down theory from the 70s and the 80s to maternal and child health care. I've lived through them all. But it's easy to be cynical about all these changes. What it reflects is the knowledge and understanding at the time of development needs, as well as the changing requirements in the individual countries. Take education as one simple example. We first went through the phase of building schools. Then we moved on to training teachers. Next, it was persuading parents to let their kids stay in school instead of staying at home to work in the fields. Then it was focusing on getting girls into school. And now the concentration is on the quality of the education that they receive. What that tells me is that today's wider development focus is far more on the conditions necessary to achieve worthwhile results. So we're talking about capacity building, ensuring that the sector that you're working in is properly structured and staffed, has good policies, good training and management, and adequate funding. And for the future, this is where I see development being focused, creating and maintaining the capacity for the sector to function effectively and to produce results. So where should we be doing this, and who should be doing it? To be successful, development cooperation must be based on development needs and not political needs. So we should only work in countries that have real development requirements and not do it because there are political advantages to our being there. Having said that, we cannot possibly work in every country that has needs. So I think we should focus on the countries that are making serious efforts, and we should leave or stay out of those countries in which it is unclear where the money is going or what the effort is producing. As to who should do it, I would like to suggest that government agencies like CEDA are not terribly well suited to executing development projects. Over the years, a large number of Canadian non-governmental organizations and institutions, as well as private sector firms, have shown excellent capacity to implement development projects. I think these should be the main implementers. I know the previous government tried its best to discredit or even destroy the development assistance capacity of the admirable Canadian non-governmental sector, and it did little to finance the private sector in truly developmental projects, preferring to spend $8 to support the Canadian private sector's own commercial interests. But the capacity of both these sectors to implement development projects has not been destroyed, and we should revive and rebuild it. Government agencies can be very good at developing aid policies and at helping recipient countries to design an appropriate aid program that meets their priorities. Aid agencies also have the political weight to negotiate with and influence the international community. This is what I think they should focus on. However, as I said before, I think they are not ideally suited to implement projects for a number of reasons. First is the government budgetary cycle. Development is a long-term process, but the budget cycle in government is almost never longer than 5 years. And the government wants to see results in that time. If your aid intervention is realistically going to take 10 to 15 years before you begin to see concrete results, you will inevitably find yourself spending enormous energy trying to justify interim short-term results in order to get funding for the next 5-year cycle. And guess what? Everybody from the project officer to the Treasury Board specialist to the Auditor General to the press knows that these interim results don't mean anything. You're not going to be able to change the budgetary cycle, so you should find a different way of doing development projects. Devolve it to someone else and make funding contingent on agreed progress reports. The second reason is the political factor. If CEDA, for example, is itself implementing a project, it is much easier for a minister or an MP to influence that project in some way than if it is being implemented by a third party. And third is the cost. You can't implement a project in Africa or Southeast Asia from Gatineau. You have to be on the ground to do it properly. When you locate a public servant overseas, the system takes charge, specifying housing requirements, allowances, and conditions of service that are very expensive. And in today's world, you add to all that the security cost of protecting them. NGOs, for example, are much more nimble, typically teaming up with a local partner, using local expertise and paying local wages that do not distort the local remuneration structure. So third parties can do the job of project implementation very effectively, and more importantly, at a lower cost than aid agency typically can. In summary then, I think Canada's aid effort in the future should focus on building capacity, doing so only in countries that are serious about achieving results, and that Canada's official development organization concentrate on policy and program development and negotiating international agreements, and devolve implementation to competent third parties. Thank you.
Okay. Now going back in time, our next speaker will be Ian Smillie, a McGill graduate. He's lived and worked in Sierra Leone, Nigeria, and Bangladesh. He was founder of the Canadian NGO Inter Pares and was executive director of CUSO. He has worked at Tufts and Tulane universities and as a development consultant with many Canadian, American, and European organizations. The author of several books. His most recent book is Diamonds, was published in 2014. He is also was the designer of the Kimberley Process certification system for rough diamonds and was the first witness at the war crimes trial of Liberian warlord Charles Taylor. He chairs the Diamond Development Initiative and is the president of the Canadian Association for the Study of International Development, or CASIDS. So I turn the floor over.
Well, thank you very much. Let me start by making a pitch for CASID, the Canadian Association for the Study of International Development. I chair the board and never miss a chance to advertise. If you're not a member of CASID and you're a student at McGill, you get a 15% discount on the membership because the Institute for the Study of International Development is one of our institutional members. With it, you get the journal. The journal costs $109. You can get it for $24. When I was enrolled in Economics 100 at McGill, I'm pretty sure I didn't think I would be back here 53 years later. In fact, I probably didn't think I would be anywhere 53 years later. But I know I didn't think about bringing one of the books that was assigned reading back with me. And this is a book that I've kept. I haven't kept very many of the books that were assigned reading, but this one has been very useful, How to Lie with Statistics. This book was already 10 years old when I read it first, and it's still in print. And the title will give you a hint as to why it's in print, and you'll get the relevance of my reference to it when I go through what I have to say. It's become fashionable in some quarters to say that foreign aid is becoming irrelevant. Aid spending, it's said, is tiny in comparison to remittances sent home by diaspora communities. It's dwarfed by foreign direct investment. Let's stop thinking about aid. Let's all get on board the train to global markets, trade, investments, and prosperity. Well, it's true. Global remittances do outstrip aid spending by a factor of 4 if you take the global statistics. But that's the headline. Of the $460 billion received globally in personal remittances in 2013, 30% went to only 3 countries, India, the Philippines, and China. An additional 30% of it went to high-income countries, including Germany, France, and the United States. This is a statistic that's always left out of the big numbers. According to the World Bank, less than 6% of it went to low-income countries. Remittances can certainly be important to the economy of a developing country, but they're not a generalized horn of plenty, and they're not a substitute for what aid can do. In numerical terms, foreign direct investment has grown dramatically in recent years. In 2013, foreign direct investment to developing countries totaled $778 billion, while ODA, official development assistance, was $150 billion. In other words, foreign direct investment outstripped aid spending by a factor of 5. But more than half of that $778 billion went to Asia, most of it to China, which is still on the list as a developing country. Only 7% of it went to Africa, and of that, half of it went to North Africa, South Africa, and Mozambique. Economists, mesmerized by totals and averages, too often equate national economic growth with development and poverty reduction. But GDP averages can mask a reality in which improvement to the lives of those at the bottom has simply not occurred, while the disparity between rich and poor widens into a chasm. Chad, for example, has enjoyed very high levels of foreign direct investment since 2001, more than $2 billion in some years. It clocks an annual growth rate about double that of the United States, and it has a per capita income greater than half the countries in Africa. And yet Chad's life expectancy is low, adult literacy rates are terrible, and on the UN's Human Development Index, it ranks 184th out of 187 countries, 4th from the bottom. More than 60% of Chad's people live on less than $1.25 a day. The economy of Chad grew, thanks mainly to foreign investment in the oil sector, but life for the average citizen remains almost as bad as it was before the investment began. Foreign direct investment and remittances can be important to low-income countries, but even at their best, they're not enough. The answer to development isn't one thing. It's many things. It includes trade, it includes access to markets, infrastructure, good government. The question is not whether remittances, foreign investment, and the market are alternatives to aid, but whether aid can deliver on its part of the promise. And the answer to that question isn't so clear. Recently, the World Bank has been telling us that the number of people living in absolute poverty fell by half in the last 2 decades, from 2 to 1 billion. In truth, there is no contemporaneous data from earlier years that pegs the number of absolute poor at 2 billion. You won't find it in World Bank data. You won't find that number, 2 billion, in World Bank data for 1980 or 1990 or 2000. Not anywhere. Percentages have declined, but absolute numbers have actually remained static. The bank's triumphalism is false, based on a manipulation of data, ever-changing definitions, and a use of statistics that would have made the author of this book proud. In much of Africa, poverty is worse today than ever before. There were 116 million more people living in absolute poverty in Africa in 2012 than there were in 1990. More people than live altogether in Spain, Belgium, Canada, and Australia. Where aid's concerned, the challenge in reducing poverty is often framed in terms of technique, the how of aid, whether one approach is better than another. A preceding issue, however, is the diversion of aid away from its stated purpose into byways where no amount of technique will make it more effective. For more than half of the modern aid era, development assistance was as much about the Cold War as it was about anything else. Huge amounts of aid money were given to governments that were led by, not to put too fine a point on it, criminals. These criminals didn't misspend the money. The donors did by giving it to them. They did it knowingly, year after year, decade after decade, and the phenomenon didn't end with the Cold War. If donors were serious about poverty reduction, one might think that a preponderance of aid would go to the poorest countries. Not so. In fact, only 1/3 of all ODA goes to the least developed countries. And yet for the poorest countries, ODA is critical. For most, the question of remittances and foreign direct investment doesn't arise. For them, ODA makes up more than 2/3 of all external finance. In other words, the countries most in need of development assistance are getting the least, and their share is actually in decline. When we do get to the question of aid effectiveness, we need to heavily discount or remove some types of aid spending. We should remove or discount ODA spent in pursuit of political, strategic, and security interests. Charles mentioned some of this. ODA spent in pursuit of commercial interests. ODA tied directly or indirectly to a country's own goods and services. ODA spent on humanitarian assistance. Humanitarian assistance has its place and is often badly needed, but it isn't development assistance, not the same thing. ODA spent on refugees during their first year in the donor country. We can count the money we spend on refugees when they come here. This is money that stays here. It's not money that goes overseas. The cost of administering the aid program, of course, and the cost of foreign student subsidies estimated in Canada at $300 million year before last. The point of all this is to say that if you want results in terms of poverty reduction, money has to be spent in ways that demonstrate a contribution to that effort. A great deal of the world's development assistance, perhaps half or even 2/3, does not. And then there's the question about whether the overall amount is enough to do more than just scratch the surface of global poverty. As I said, in 2013, global ODA totaled $150 billion. If 1/3 of that actually went towards programs aimed at alleviating poverty in very poor countries, it would be less than is spent in a year in the United States on feeding cats and dogs. Canada has in recent years become one of the least generous of aid donors. We're down to 0.24% of GNI, very close to our historical low, much of it skewed to commercial, political, and strategic ends. So critics shouldn't be surprised that foreign aid hasn't done a great deal to reduce deeply entrenched poverty. A large part of the money has been spent on other things, and the volumes were never very substantial anyway. There is plenty of evidence, however, from projects where poverty reduction is front and center, that aid can and does work. Vaccinations work, clean drinking water works, education works, small and medium enterprise works. Without healthy, educated people, without basic infrastructure, there isn't likely to be much foreign investment, much trade, much peace, or much development. Ending global poverty is the right thing to do. It shouldn't be necessary or acceptable for generations of children in their millions to live wretched, abject, miserable lives. But if we are unable to deal with the problem for the right and most obvious reasons, we might consider self-interest. Self-interest properly understood, as de Tocqueville put it. If the rich countries hope to stay rich, to stay healthy and secure, and to interact and trade with others, they can't continue to ignore the pestilence, poverty, and conflict that ravage poor countries and poor communities within not-so-poor countries. It's more luck than anything else that kept Ebola confined to West Africa. National borders can no longer contain health threats like this, any more than they can contain the international impact of pollution and war. In 2015, there were more refugees and displaced people than at any time since World War II, hundreds of thousands of them pouring unchecked across European borders and across the into the American South. At the same time, disaffected young men in ruined countries have been flocking in droves to dangerous organizations like Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, Al-Qaeda, and ISIL. Nobody really knows how much of this might have been reduced or prevented by development, but in the worst hit areas, there really hasn't been much development. There is plenty of evidence in Asia and Latin America, however, that health, education, rights, and jobs are self-reinforcing parts of a virtuous circle, one to which outsiders can certainly contribute. As for the future, poverty reduction and development will not be advanced by magical thinking, shirking responsibility, faking success, or lying with statistics. And it won't be advanced by pretending that it has nothing to do with us, or that if it continues, the negative impact on the economies and the children of rich countries will not grow. Thank you.
And our last speaker, Julia Sanchez, is President CEO of CCIC since 2001. And she came to this position with more than 18 years of experience in top-level international development management, including 13 years working in developing countries. Prior to joining CCIC, she served as Regional and National Campaigns Director for the Global Campaign for Climate Action. And previous to that, she worked for 14 years at the Center for International Studies and Cooperation, CESI. She's also a McGill alum, having political science and economics double major, and returning to McGill to get an MA in economics. Her specialization is in development and international economics. So thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Ça me fait vraiment plaisir d'être ici. C'est la première fois que je suis invitée à parler à McGill. Alors, c'est vraiment un honneur. So I'm also going to speak in English, but of course, je serai content de répondre à des questions en français après. So, what are we, by the way, you added 10 years to my life, which I didn't have. I only joined CCAC in 2011, because if I had joined in 2001 with 18 years experience, that would make me a little older than I am. So I just wanted to clarify for the record. Don't want to create false impressions. So I am a bit younger than the two gentlemen who spoke before me. And so I'm going to focus on what I see moving forward in this domain. So, there was some allusion to the moment that we're living in right now, both globally and in Canada. So I want to talk about that a little bit, and then talk about where Canada and the sector can be moving forward. So as I'm sure, I hope many of you have heard, in September last year, 2015, there was a new framework for international development or international cooperation that was adopted, a new global framework, and it's called the Sustainable Development Goals, or now referred to as the Global Goals, or sometimes Agenda 2030. So it is a framework for the next 15 years, so from January 1st of this year until 2030, to achieve a whole bunch of wonderful things and really transform the world. It's quite ambitious, actually, in its projections. So this agenda, the SDGs, replace a prior 15-year agenda, which was called the MDGs. So those are the Millennium Development Goals, and those were adopted in 2000, and we had 8. We had 8 Millennium Development Goals. One of them, the first one, was meant to focus donor and development efforts around reducing poverty to half. So that was the goal number 1, and then we had different goals for different, many of the things that were already mentioned by the two gentlemen that spoke before me. So we have concluded that first 15 years, and now what were we left with? Ian has alluded to that. Still a lot of challenges out there. The MDGs did show some success. There was some success, and a lot of that is attributed to the fact that it did really focus collective global efforts around 8 very concrete, tangible results. There was progress more in some areas of the world, less in others, but definitely some gaps and some questions that emerged, like, okay, maybe even if we achieved the goal, if we got all the kids into school and sat them in front of their desks, did their quality of education actually improve, for example? So questions that started going beyond the tangible goal to a little bit of what's happening beneath that, and is it really sustainable in the long term? So, but I do want to mention that some of the gaps as we were concluding the MDGs that were clearly identified, Sub-Saharan Africa, conflict and afflicted states and fragile states, definitely very little, if any, progress at all in those environments. So there's something about the MDGs that wasn't going far enough or deep enough to address extreme poverty, especially in certain the more difficult parts of the world, if you will. So when the global community 3 years ago started having conversations, consultations, dialogues, surveys, evaluations about, okay, what next? So we achieved a lot. We achieved a lot in some places, much less in others. But now, how do we replace the MDG agenda? What do we need to go further? And so the SDGs are significantly different. I'm going to try to highlight very quickly some of the key differences so that then we can reflect on what this means for Canada. So instead of 8 goals, we have 17. So that is a lot more. Is it too much? Many complained, and Canada was one of the countries that was very nervous around having such a big agenda. A counter argument to saying it's too much, it's all over the place, is, well, maybe that encompasses everything. So that if we actually manage to address all these 17 goals everywhere, then we will really nail it. Because there's nothing that seems to be lying outside those 17 goals. Whereas we knew going into the MDGs that they were limited and very focused and that they weren't going to address everything, but we were hoping they would address some priorities. So much more complex, bigger agenda, more ambitious agenda. It's not only a question of breadth, of addressing more issues, but it's also trying to go deeper. So instead of focusing on very tangible results, like the example I gave before of getting children into schools, it's trying to go deeper and see what are some of the structural root causes generating the problems, the symptoms of poverty, and can we do something systemically and in an organized and focused fashion about that? So this agenda, very differently from the prior one, talks about inequality, which I think we are increasingly hearing about is a huge global challenge. It's also a challenge in Canada. It talks about climate change. So this is another interesting feature. The MDGs were very much the socioeconomic development stream of conversations in the UN, whereas there was a separate parallel stream that was dealing with climate and biodiversity and other environmental issues. The SDGs has made an attempt to bring these together, and with some level of success, we hope. And so the SDGs actually incorporate and make a very clear link between development, socioeconomic development, and the need to address climate change. So that's also interesting. The rights, so it's a much more rights-based agenda than the MDGs were. So again, trying to address some of the root causes, structural issues that are impeding development. And also very importantly, it does put at the very center of the agenda the whole question of peace and conflict. And as I mentioned, and other mentions as well, that's definitely in the countries that are in conflict where we're still seeing the greatest difficulty to achieve some of these development objectives. So the most interesting, I would say, and these are all very interesting and very dramatically different aspects of the new agenda, but perhaps the most interesting, and definitely for us as a country in Canada, is that this agenda is universal. So what does that mean? So the UN, all countries in the UN, including Canada, adopted this agenda and acknowledged that it is a universal agenda, which means that we are no longer talking about us and them. So it's not, the MDGs was very much about there's a problem out there, and we, the donor countries, Canada and European countries, we are going to put the money forward, the projects, the ideas to solve their problem. This agenda breaks that up completely and says, actually, we have problems everywhere. And one of the ambitions of the agenda is to eliminate, to leave no one behind. That's become one of the taglines. So it's to eliminate extreme poverty everywhere. So do we have extreme poverty in Canada? Yes, we do. And we cannot globally eliminate poverty everywhere if we don't also eliminate poverty in Canada and in Norway and in Germany and wherever else it is, right? So on all the goals, this agenda is saying we have to address these issues everywhere. And that talks to a point that was made earlier about the interdependence, the growing acknowledgement of the interdependence of our prosperity, of any country's prosperity, with everybody else's prosperity, right? So that we, as a very prosperous country, which Canada is, cannot pretend that we can continue being prosperous indefinitely if the world around us isn't able to also achieve prosperity. And I would say that the reverse of that is also being acknowledged, that if we continue to have issues in Canada around education or malnutrition or housing in our country, then that affects the global picture on those issues as well. So this is the new SDG agenda. So as we're adopting this agenda in September, late September in 2015, a couple weeks later, we had an election in Canada. And we, in the sector, in the NGO sector that I come from, were campaigning around the SDG agenda, but talking about 2015 as the year where we would both have a new global agenda and hopefully a new national agenda as well, and that these could feed off each other very well. Thankfully, we do. And we do have a government that is much better positioned, at least in discourse or in intent, to benefit and to work with this agenda at a global level, but also in Canada. So around the question of universality, before the election, our previous government was very, very, very hesitant to accept that Canada would also need to be accountable to the rest of the world of how we were addressing these poverty issues in our own country. Whereas the new government has said, yes, that is the nature of the agenda, it makes sense, and we're going to embark in it. So we are expected, like every other country, to have a national action plan to implement the SDGs in Canada, which will have both, in our case, because we're a donor country or a prosperous country, we'll have an internal component to that plan of how we're going to address these issues in Canada, but it will also have an external component of how we're contributing to other countries who have less capacity so that they can achieve these goals as well. So where does aid fit into all this, and what does that look like moving forward for Canada? So I want to argue, perhaps a little bit differently than those who spoke before me, that we need to break out of the assumption, I think it is an assumption, that the aid file, if you will, is the domain of what used to be CEDA, the NGOs that work in international development, and a couple of progressive companies that are doing good projects on the ground, and that it's confined to that little universe, and that the rest of Canada is not really concerned with this, that this is our little piece of expertise, our little piece of turf, and we're the ones that have to do better, have better practices, have better policies, and get on with it in a better way. I would argue that the fact that we have this agenda that is acknowledging the interlinkages between everything we do in Canada with everything that happens outside in both directions, that we need to, one, adopt an all-of-government approach, first of all, and second, we need to adopt an all-of-Canada approach. So I'm going to briefly try to convey what that means, or what I'm trying to say by that. So in the all-of-government approach, it's not only about Global Affairs Canada, which used to be DFAT-D, which used to be CEDA. It's now about much more than that. So case in point, immigration. We are seeing every day right now in our reality how our immigration policy and all our interactions with the rest of the world through our immigration policy is having such an important impact on a very current global challenge. So our immigration department has to be part, and the policies they adopt, the funding that they have, the programs that they have, part of that global engagement of Canada with the rest of the world. Our agricultural departments, our health departments, I could go on and on. It goes way beyond Global Affairs Canada. And what the universality of the SDG agenda invites us to do at a government level is to really look across the government at all the departments and say, what are these departments doing and what could they be doing differently to contribute towards this global agenda? Some countries are already doing that. It's very interesting. Germany, for example, is undergoing all of government policy review with SDG lenses on. They're looking at every single department, every single policy, and trying to stack it up against the SDG ambition and see if they're up to the challenge. Colombia, a developing country, is doing the same thing, even though they're immersed in a conflict. Even their peace agreement that they're negotiating is using some of the indicators and the targets of the SDG agenda. So we are not there yet, but it's something that we could envision. Also, all of government horizontally. So it's not about the federal government, definitely not in Canada, where a lot of these issues around development, like health, education, are of a provincial nature. So we need to involve our provincial governments, our cities, et cetera. And I think if you think about climate change, for example, where we've seen leadership in Canada in recent years, is definitely not at the federal level. It has been more at the city level and sometimes at the provincial level. So we can see a lot of leadership and engagement with this kind of global agenda coming from different tiers of our government system. The rest of Canada, to end, means that it's not just the government, it's everybody else. I was part of a team co-chaired by Margaret Biggs and John MacArthur. Margaret Biggs was a former president of CEDA, and John MacArthur is a Canadian economist working at the Brookings Institute. And we tried to do a mapping of the ecosystem in Canada. Who should be involved in global development efforts. So we identified, of course, the NGOs, the traditional sectors in government, but then the rest of government, as I just described. But we also looked at the private sector, we looked at philanthropy, we looked at the academic sector and the students, the young people, what's happening with them. And our analysis or our conclusion at looking around us was that we're not doing very well, that all of these sectors, including the traditional NGO sector, including our global affairs, including the rest of government, definitely our philanthropy, we don't have any kind of significant engagement of philanthropists on global issues. Definitely our universities, we're not producing those global ideas that are being picked up in other, as we have in the past. So we thought that we're all underperforming, but not only that we're all underperforming individually, but that we're not working with each other. And we believe that because we're not working enough with each other, we're also lowering our capacity to contribute to these global debates and finding solutions to these global challenges. So we are proposing, that paper proposes, and I believe this is something I believe from my work, that we all, in our different capacities as individual citizens, as academics, as students, as private sector leaders, as NGO leaders, as government leaders, we all need to think about what we do, but also what our country does and how it interacts with the rest of the globe in a very, very different way to contribute in all those domains of interactions towards a more prosperous world. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Sorry about that. Okay, thank you. It was a really important panel. I think what's important to emphasize too is that what the panel as a whole reminds us is what we're all about when we talk about development, improving people's lives. It's not politics with a small p, electoral cycles, bureaucratic infighting, private sector versus public sector. It's not politics with a big P, ideology, left, right, and etc. But it's how to make people's lives better. It's not numbers, but what those numbers mean on the ground. It's hard to achieve, it's multi-layered, which is a good reason to focus back on the SDGs, which reminds us we're all in it together. And so because the panel was so parsimonious in their words, we've got a good amount of time for questions and answers. I'd like to remind you it is questions and answers. You're here to hear the answers of my distinguished panel. Therefore, please keep your questions short and clear and concise so that we can answer more of them. And we only want to hear your questions because you want to hear what the panelists have to say. So I think what we'll do is we'll take a round of 3. You can direct it at individuals or the whole panel. It's up to you. But we'll do 3. I'll hand it over to the panel, and then we'll do another 3 until we run out of time. So there's microphones here and there.
Hi, thank you all to all the panelists. My name is Chris Bourne. I'm a political science instructor at Dawson College, and I'm on the board of directors of the Greater Montreal branch of the United Nations Association. And the question is primarily inspired by Ambassador Bassett's comments, although I'd be interested in the thoughts of the others about this dichotomy between government aid and NGO effectively aid. Where do you see multilateral development agencies such as the UNDP, UNICEF, other agencies such as that as fitting into this new framework you're proposing? Thank you.
They clearly have a role, they have a big role, and traditionally Canada has been a big supporter of the UN agencies. Over the last few years, we've ended up giving more and more and more of our money to the UN, and thereby limiting the capacity of Canadians to do development. I think we should rebuild that capacity of Canadians to do development, but not at the expense of the UN institutions. I mean, I don't want to see us reducing our contribution to UNICEF or to FAO. I mean, these are very important. We've always supported them. We should still continue to support them, but we should also be building up our own capacity.
Hey, Julia.
Yeah, if I could come in on that. It's a great question, and I think one thing that I didn't talk about is how the roles of these different stakeholders can change, the traditional ones, if you will, which is contained in your question. My sense is that increasingly for the NGO sector, and I'll come to the multilateral in a second, for the NGO sector, we increasingly need to stop implementing projects. I'm in a bit, not contradicting, but taking a slightly different take than what was said previously. I think that, I know that the capacity on the ground of civil society groups, of local governments, is growing, and so we have to rely on that. But we should be strengthening that. Our focus should be to strengthen that and not to implement projects directly. So that trend has already started. But the interesting thing is, and then what does become our role? So I think in this, globalizing world where our global challenges are globalized, not only our economies and what have you. Civil society, in solidarity with its civil society partners, counterparts on the ground, needs to focus more on policies, on advocating and promoting and doing research towards better policies, and not policies strictly on aid. Aid is crucial, it's very strategic, but it is small, and it's a key part of a larger set of resources that we need to mobilize in support of global development. So I think a lot of our member organizations, NGOs in our sector in Canada, are starting to and need to continue engaging with policy discussions in Canada around policies that have huge impact on the developing world. Again, climate is the perfect example, right? If we really care about development, but we don't get involved in the climate debates in Canada because that's not our thing, because we work overseas, then we're missing the big picture, because that's the kind of policy that can do enormous damage or enormous good to our partners and to the countries that we are working in if we get it right. On the multilaterals, I think it's important to distinguish that multilaterals they can do things on the ground that no NGO could ever do, and no foreign government should ever do. And so I think there's been a bit of a confusion around that. And so sometimes we see donor countries giving money to UN agencies to implement projects that maybe even international NGOs shouldn't be implementing. Maybe that should go directly to the actors on the ground. But there is that confusion, right? There's the coordinating role, for example, of the multilaterals, which is essential because it is messy, and there are sometimes thousands of actors on the ground doing different things. So somebody needs to be overseeing, convening, and coordinating that. That is, during humanitarian crisis, also a critical role that the UN plays. So it's those kinds of roles that I agree need to be protected, and Canada needs to continue contributing and strengthen that role. But we have to be clear about what that role is, right? And it's not just giving the UN money so that they do everything at the expense of potentially Canadian NGOs, but more importantly, local actors who should be doing this stuff themselves.
Just very quickly, I think one of the problems has been that some governments have seen the multilateral agencies as just another implementing agency. So UNDP does this kind of thing, and UNHCR does that kind of thing. They're just another player, and we can give them money, and they will do it for us, essentially. A lot of the money that goes to these organizations is earmarked. The Nordics are particularly bad at this, earmarking funds, essentially making the multilaterals a servant of a bilateral program. The reason we have multilaterals is not that. It's to even out the peaks and valleys that exist when individual governments aren't there. I think about countries like Sierra Leone, one that I know very well, where there aren't very many bilateral agencies at all. The bilateral agencies are all crowding into places like Mozambique, where one of the better performers, they can get a better bang for their buck. So countries, some of the most fragile countries, are being ignored. This is where the multilaterals can actually play a role. And if we're serious about this universality of the Sustainable Development Goals, we really have to have a multilateral approach to things. We can't keep doing things individually, country by country. I mean, we have to do that, but we have to be more international.
Thank you.
Hello, thank you panelists for this wonderful speech. My name is Brijlal Chaudhary. I'm from Nepal, and I'm here as a John Savay Fellow in Montreal for a year. I have two questions. The first one is, like one of our panelists said, that we don't work with, how to say, corruption is a big deal in international development, and we should work with countries which are less corrupt. But if you look at the poor countries who have development needs, but when you compare it with the what do you call it? Transparency International, they do poorly in those reports. And I was wondering, how do we break that circle? They have development needs, but they're corrupt. How do we break that? And the second question is, international development ideas are wonderful, SDGs are a wonderful thing, but the way I see it, as working in Nepal for 10 years with an NGO, the bigger donors, they outsource the work, same work, to another INGO, and that INGO outsource the same work to other INGO, and that INGO outsource the same work to a national NGO in Kathmandu, and that NGO finds another NGO to do the same exact work. And I feel that it's a very good intention to help those countries and help those people, but when we come to the final recipient of the program, it's so little money that they come up with data that doesn't even exist. And thank you for that book. I completely agree that we are just lying to ourselves when it comes to data. We're just producing false data, and based on those false data, we are creating another program which is disaster. And I was wondering, how do we break this circle? Why is international development not competitive? Why is it not open to the wider community? It's very controlled by few people, and it's not accessible to development NGOs in developing countries. They have to link it through, advocate for the funds that are coming in. They have to go for drinks, buy them drinks, and it's the same thing at every single level. And how do we break that? As an expert, I would like your answers. Thank you.
Who wants to try and go first? Ian.
I'll just take the first 17 questions. Corruption, well, there's all kinds of corruption. In fact, I'm just writing a paper on corruption, trying to get my head around this. As I said, I think a lot of the corruption in the aid business started with the donors. Mobutu Sese Seko in the Democratic Republic of Congo received lashings of foreign aid, tons of foreign aid from Western countries. We knew he was corrupt. We were not kidding ourselves. I mean, it was about the Cold War. It was about winning friends and influencing people. And far too much aid has gone into that. We have a very hard time calling a spade a spade. There are ways to avoid corrupt governments and still provide assistance to a country. You can work through NGOs, and maybe there are other things. It is tough, it isn't easy, but by pretending that it isn't there, by ignoring it, of course, you don't really get anywhere. And by supporting it, as we've done, that's a problem. This talking about so many NGOs and the money going through 10 different hands before it actually gets there, I think one of the problems is that we've got too many NGOs. We have at least, Julio, you can correct me, I think, how many members have you got in CCIC? 100?
Yeah, but that's very little. There's probably about 1,500 groups in Canada doing some kind of international development work. 1,500 groups in a country like Canada. Now, the United States is 10 times the size, so you might think there would be maybe 15,000 American organizations, and then 10,000 Germans and 5,000 Brits. I mean, just imagine all of these organizations out there looking for projects and partners and doing good things. Many of them are very small, but they're very well-intentioned, and they take up a lot of time and space, especially around humanitarian earthquakes and that kind of thing. Somehow this has got to be rationalized. It isn't getting rationalized. There are more and more of these boutique NGOs coming up. More and more people want to go overseas to build a school during their summer holidays. It's nonsense. Nonsense. You think people in developing countries don't know how to build a school? Of course, they have a nice experience, they come back, they're educated and all the rest of it, but I think we have a more fundamental problem in understanding development, understanding the challenge of development. This is one of my pet themes, and that is that Canadians
although they are very supportive of international development, any opinion poll, lots of support, and you can see it when there's an emergency. The donations flow very generously. But our understanding of what it's all about is very, very slender. Most Canadians don't get it. World Vision, which is the biggest Canadian NGO and which raises 80% of its money on child sponsorship, spends 10 times more on fundraising in this country than the Canadian government does on public engagement around international development issues. And Canadians see development through the emergency lens and to a very large extent through child sponsorship. Child sponsorship is paternalistic. Think about the word. It's paternalistic. You can help save one child. It works. It's a wonderful fundraiser, but it does nothing to explain what's going on. The child is the symptom of the problem. The problem is that the parents don't have work, or there's something more fundamental going on. I'm going beyond your question, but it has something to do with corruption. The corruption in our understanding of what it's all about, and what we can do as individuals or as organizations to deal with it. It isn't about adopting a child or creating another mom and pop boutique to go off and build a school in Kenya. We have to get more grown up about this.
Charles? A quick answer to your second question about the money going from one body to another body to another. Right at the start, you really have to pay attention to how you design the project. And you should design the project in such a way that you know that the money is going to the people who are going to implement it and not to a series of pass-through organizations. So I think it comes down to being really, really careful and sensible in the way you design the project and picking your final partner. On the corruption issue, I'm going to be really personal because I still have the scars on my back from my battle in 1993 with Robert Mugabe. I was the Canadian High Commissioner, and our aid program in Zimbabwe was based on trying to develop economic growth, which you could do in a country like that. It was tremendously well-educated population, great infrastructure, good institutions. So we were focusing on economic growth and trying to persuade foreign investors to go and invest so that you could create local employment. And in the middle of all of this, Mugabe decides he's going to take over all the white-owned farms. Now, there is a long line of people who are behind me on the injustices of the whites owning all the land in Zimbabwe, so don't get me wrong on that. My problem was, I said to the government, if you do this and refuse a legal right for them to at least apply for compensation through the courts, because most of them had been there 50, 60, 80, or 100 years, then you're going to destroy any attempt that you're making to attract foreign investment. No, they were going to do that. There was going to be no appeal through the court. In fact, they changed the law to disallow anybody from going to court to try and get compensation. And when you're living in the country, you know what's going on. It was quite clear that this was not to reallocate the firms to all the black Zimbabwean peasants who had no land. It was to divvy it up to the party faithful. And that's exactly what happened. And so I made a bit of a fuss about it. And in the end, I somehow managed to leave the country, but as I say, with scars on my back. And what did Canada do? Went on funding the aid program for Zimbabwe, 94, 95, 96, 2000, 2003, and so did everybody else. And you know why? Because everybody in the West so desperately needed a black African country to succeed, And they thought Zimbabwe was the best prospect. So the whole thing was done for that political ambition. In the end, it finally dawned on everybody, this is not going to work out, because by then he'd been given the comfort of the farmer's experience. He'd gone on and taken over some firms. Then he got in with Museveni and went into Central Africa. And by the World Bank's estimate, came out of that. He sent his army in to quell the rebellion that was going on there, and came out with what was estimated at $600 million worth of diamonds. You know, when you see this happening, you've got to do something about it. And if you don't do something about it, it's going to go on. And by the way, this country is not free from corruption either.
Did you want to say?
Just very quickly, I think part of the solution from a Canadian perspective to some of these questions is having a decentralized decision-making power over what gets funded and what doesn't. We don't have that in Canada. Actually, I think we're probably worse than we ever were. I mean, there's a huge centralization in Ottawa, in a certain building, on a certain floor, in a certain office, of almost every decision of every project that gets funded with Canadian government funding. So that takes you so far away from the real actors, the people who are really on the ground who can do this, right? We've, in principle, agreed in Canada to decentralize our aid program, but in practice, the money hasn't followed. We sent people to the field, but we gave them no decision-making power, no budget. So that has to change, and I think that could address some of the challenges that you were talking about. And I just wanted to reinforce the challenge that we have of talking about such a complex issue in a simple or semi-simple way, right? And it is, as Ian was alluding to the success of the very simple message of, you can save one child and it's very simple, you just write your check and it's done. Development is so complex. And how do we convey that to ordinary Canadians and get their support and get them on board without making them dizzy and totally overwhelming them on the way? I think we have an opportunity with the SDGs. The fact that the SDGs is a universal agenda, it's talking about, let's look at what's happening in Canada. That's easier for people to understand. So if we can, use that as a leverage to talk to Canadians differently about, yes, this is messy and it's complex, but there's a story here, and we can engage proactively and we can contribute to the solution. So,
thank you. Floor is yours.
Hello, Michel David. This is not my domain. This is not my domain, but listening to you, there's a dimension maybe you could clarify for me. You mentioned that in terms of the STG, the donor countries should do, ideally, an inventory and develop a view of their total system and how it interacts with the poorer world, the receiver world, I guess. What if the donor countries, in terms of my trade, you could sort of map them and say, well, Germany is probably the leader, whatever, there's one, and then there's a ranking. I mean, some are, there, and others are not there at all. But similarly for the receptor countries, some countries, and you were just talking about Zimbabwe, so there probably are among the, 100 receptor countries or something like that, there probably are a certain number, let's say 20, that are sort of the blue chip, that they've got a good plan, they're fairly transparent, they're fairly honest, they're working on the right things. So obviously, when you take a top donor country working with a top receptor country, you probably get a lot of bang for your dollar, and inversely, of course. Does that take place in any way? And the point I remember, just out of curiosity, is I had read Romeo Dallaire's exit speech at the Senate when he left. And his point was that Canada should take one country, Congo or something like that, and apply everything we know to that country and do a real job on that and forget the rest and somebody will take care of another one, and somebody will, anyways, that was his suggestion. And so I'm just using that as an example to illustrate my AABBCC type of situation. And for the C receptor countries, don't we have a program to get them out of the ditch first? I mean, you know, help yourself and somebody will help you. But if you don't help yourself, you know, what's the purpose? Okay, are we just blowing money away? Anyways, so this is a categorization that is really starting with the basic business unit, the country. My question.
Should I take a first stab at that? Thank you for the question. I think your question helps me elaborate a little bit more on why I'm arguing that we are living in a different world now. So it's not about us and them anymore. First of all, donor countries and recipient countries, it's becoming quite blurry, right? So we have the ones that are clearly donor countries, but that might not be. I mean, we have countries in Europe that all of a sudden, whoops, you know, they were perceived as part of our club, but they're on shaky ground right now. We have countries like India, China, that both receive and contribute. They have a dual. They're both donors and recipient countries. So it's becoming very, very complex. You know, Mexico is a donor country, Brazil. I mean, so it's not so easy now to say these guys and those guys, right? And I think in acknowledgement to that complex set of realities and relationships is that this agenda is really saying, you know, we have to kind of stop thinking so much in those terms. Of course, there are the countries who have the capacity to be donors also. So we're saying, okay, the countries like Canada, in our action plan, we would be looking at how do we address these goals in our country? And of course, we don't have problems on all 17. We might have problems on 6 of the 17 that we need to address in Canada. So how can this framework help us do that? And then for the rest of it, how can we contribute to other countries? The idea of you know, matching up countries, if you will, or dividing up the world and saying if we focus on one, maybe it's an interesting idea, but I think the loss there would be that if we have an expertise in Canada, good governance or women's rights, it might be more effective for us to work with a set of countries that have particular challenges in that field and can really benefit, or that are at the cusp of being able to do transformational change on that issue that we have particular expertise in, than to try to do everything in one country, all 17, let's say, of those things that need to be done. We might not be the right country to do all 17. We might be really good at 6 or 5 or 4, but not so good at the others, right? And so if they're stuck with us, then they might end up losing. So I'm just using your simple example to illustrate the complexity of these weaves, right? Sure, go ahead.
You can have a lead partner.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
With 3 or 4 other partners.
And we are going to have to choose, right? Because we can't work on all 17 goals in all countries in the world. That's impossible. Nobody can do that. So we will have to choose. So some of what you're saying can influence that thinking, right? What is it that we have? What's the value add of Canada? Not of, you know, the NGOs and CEDA or ex-CEDA. Of Canada as a country, what is it that we have to contribute towards achieving these goals? And where is the best fit? Where can we make most of a difference? I want to illustrate something that we're discussing with the government now around the need to increase our resources, but also in a focused manner. So Canada currently has 25 countries of focus, right? So we're not everywhere. We're in 25. But in those 25, we're not, and I'm going to probably not get the figure right. Maybe, Ian, you know it since you're more of a figure person than I am. But what we're arguing is that we should be one of the top 3 donors in all of those 25. Why are we going to be like the 10th donor in one of our countries of focus? Doesn't make any sense. If those are the countries we're going to focus in, then let's be in the top 3 or top 5 at least, so that we're really investing significant amount of money, not only from our perspective, but from the country's perspective, so that they look at us and say, this is one of our key donors, Canada. And we say, you're one of our key, 25 countries. So we don't have that right now. And it wouldn't take an enormous amount of additional funding to reach that. So that's one of the things that we're proposing to our current government, who is saying, we have to be a leader on the globe and Canada's back, saying, well, we need to put more resources in some of these countries where we're saying we want to be a leader, right? And let's get ourselves up. So that's the resource segment. But then the other part of your question is, what is it that we have to contribute? What is our value add? And how do we best work with countries? Is it, the really, really extreme poor countries? Is it the countries that are at the cusp of making transformation? I mean, that will vary depending on the area of expertise that we're focusing in. But there are definitely criteria and elements that can help us focus our aid so that we are more effective, right?
I think there's a couple of things about your question. One is about quantity, and the other is about quality. What you're suggesting, Julia, was something that the government wanted to do 10 years ago. They said we will focus on a fewer number of countries, and we will be among the top 5 donors.
And we're not.
In some of those countries. The truth was, even if we were among the top 5, we would be so far away from number 1 and number 2 that it really wouldn't make that much difference unless it was someplace like St. Lucia, where we were really going to throw a lot of money at it. I don't think it's the volume so much as the quality that matters. But that said, I made the point when I was making my opening remarks that only a third of official development assistance is going to the poorest countries. Everybody is going after what they call the better performers. You can get a bigger bang for your buck in Mozambique or Ethiopia than you can in Sierra Leone. There's more corruption in Sierra Leone, so why bother going to Sierra Leone and Guinea and Liberia, very corrupt countries, when you can actually get farther somewhere else? Well, one thing that happens when you ignore places like that is suddenly you get something like Ebola, and it gets out of control very, very fast. The lack of interest in Sierra Leone and Guinea and Liberia, 3 countries trying to come out of 10 years of war with very, very little, zero interest from investors, no remittances, and very, very little in the way of foreign aid. I mean, these countries were floundering. And when Ebola struck, they didn't have the resources. Now, we managed to get that under control, but it cost an enormous amount of money. And all the money that went into getting Ebola under control could have been spent on development. If we had spent even half that kind of money before the Ebola outbreak, there wouldn't have been an Ebola outbreak. It would have been contained. Yeah. So we're just playing catch up now in so many places. It's just patching things up all over the place. We've got great theory, great plans, no money.
2 quick comments. The first is, let me first say, it may not be your domain, but you sure heck understand it. Yes, there's competition between countries, and there shouldn't be. It's really stupid, but everybody's trying to get into the same favorite country and into the same favorite sector, and it makes no sense at all. And we really ought to sort that out, but I'm not hopeful that is possible because of the politics that are involved. The second, Ian's point about quality. Let me give you another real example. When I was in Central Eastern Europe, we had some projects in Romania, and we had about $5 million a year that we were spending. And I went on a program review visit, and we had one small enterprise development project. We had another project which was establishing the stock exchange, and then we had a third project where we were working with the Ministry of Social Affairs, and it was basically training nurses and all the rest of it. When I was there, I paid a courtesy visit on the head of the European Union aid program, who turned out to be an Englishman. And we were talking, he says his program was 40 million euros a year. So we chatted about what they were doing and what we were doing, and then I said, look, you're a busy man, you don't spend much time on somebody whose program is 1/10 the size of yours. And he said, I admire your program. I looked at him. He said, I'm under so much pressure to get the money out the door. I would give my eye teeth to have any one of those 3 projects that you've got, because those are making a difference here.
So, according to my understanding, we have 10 minutes left. So there's one other question, 2 questions. Maybe we'll take them both, and then we'll let the panelists answer them.
Franca Gucciardi, the CEO of the Lawrence Scholars Foundation. I wanted to follow up on Ian's point in terms of sort of the paternalistic kind of development and the NGOs that we have here that sort of are selling this. There's obviously been a rise in volunteerism as a type of development. What has been the negative impact of sort of the rise of the volunteerism, if any? And how do we actually, why is it that we don't actually regulate our own NGOs, Canadian NGOs going abroad to do this work, to sort of really make sure that who we're sending out there are actually helping?
One last question.
My name is Victor Goldblum. It's arguable that our two official languages give us affinity and conversation with a larger proportion of the world's population than most countries. We are the second in importance in the Commonwealth. Nous sommes deuxième en importance au sein de la francophonie. How well are we fulfilling our potential for constructive contribution in this regard?
Well, two brief answers to the first question. There is a regulation of NGOs. I mean, all my years in CEDA, no NGO ever got any kind of CEDA money if it didn't pass the examination, the scrutiny that the branch went through on every NGO. I mean, they looked at their track record, they looked at their staff, they looked at their abilities. So there's no regulatory framework, but boy, yes, they were regulated. It was looked after. La réponse, c'est que we don't actually live up to our reputation. And it's not just the two languages. I mean, you know, we've got the Napoleonic Code, we've got the Civil Code. We've got all sorts of advantages, and we could use them better. I think we've used them well in the past. I think they've been very advantageous to us. But we could do a lot more than we do, and part of it comes back to this whole issue of focus. It's not focusing enough resources on single issues in individual countries. I mean, all the countries we're in 4 or 5 sectors. So you say, wow, we got $50 million a year in that country. Yeah, 8 million here, 11 million there. Well, in a country where the GDP of 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 billion, 8 million is not going to do very much. So we need to have a lot more focus.
Just on this, the question about volunteerism and the negative impact, I think probably volunteerism, young kids and people going overseas on the Christmas holiday to build a school or a clinic or something. I don't think there's probably much damage done in the field in Kenya or wherever they go. Most people won't know much about it. These are construction projects that could have been undertaken by local people. They could hire somebody local to do it, but maybe people do get hired that wouldn't otherwise have got hired for the couple of weeks these people are around. I think the danger, the damage is done here. This increasing, this rapidly growing idea that I can go there and do something. And no matter how little I have to offer, I can go and build a school. I mean, these people don't know how to lay bricks. I mean, what is, it is important that that we get an understanding, a better understanding about development, but this charitable idea, this charity ethic, I think really needs to change. And I think the Canadian government can do something about it. CEDA, for many years, had a responsive program. In other words, NGOs would propose projects and programs, and the government would fund them if they liked them. There were all kinds of scrutiny and evaluations and all the rest of it. But it was all about what the organizations did overseas. You had to raise money in Canada to get matching funds, but nobody really looked too hard at how you raised that money. The Harper government did, as Charles said, huge damage to this responsive program. It put some NGOs out of business. It turned a lot of NGOs into contractors. A lot of people are hoping and believe that the new government will change this and will go back to a kind of responsive program. What I've been saying to them, and I think this is very important, they should be judged not only on what they do internationally, they should be judged on what they do in Canada. They really, and it isn't just about more public engagement, it's also about how you raise funds. It's how you portray development and people in developing countries. I think we could get a lot more value out of what NGOs do here than we have.
I agree with what Ian said. I think the real damage is here in Canada and not so much overseas. I think both of them have spoken to the degree of scrutiny that NGOs that get funding from the government, that's the problem, right? So we have, I said, about 1,500 organizations in Canada, according to their tax returns data that we have, who do some kind of giving overseas. Of those, at most 500 belong to either CCIC or the provincial councils. CCIC definitely, and many of the provincial councils, we require compliance with the standards, a code of ethics and operational standards, so there's peer scrutiny there. But of course, of those, the ones that actually get government funding are not more than 300 probably, and that's fast decreasing. So, the voluntourism kind of initiatives, if they're NGOs, and they're probably more private companies that are doing that, but not NGOs, are not part of that group that do have some of that scrutiny and even peer pressure, right? So there is an issue. But the real damage is I would agree, here in Canada. But on that note, I would like to say that the accountability issue, you won't be surprised, from the NGO sector is not with the NGOs, it's with the private sector. Because the private sector is doing enormous damage in developing countries because we don't have an accountability system in Canada, but we don't have one globally either. So there's, in this whole SDG discussion, for example, there has been enormous space given and enormous hope placed on the private sector being, the savior of the day and the one that's going to put all, because it's going to cost so much money to implement these 17 goals that we all know, and this is true, aid is not going to cover even 10% of it. So where is this money going to come from? So everybody's saying, oh, the private sector. Well, yes, maybe, but not in the unregulated way that the private sector currently does its affairs, and I'm talking about multinationals working in developing countries. Of course, the local private sector is a different story, and like here in Canada, our companies are regulated when they work in Canada. It's the minute they go outside that the whole system kind of breaks down. So I would say for development impact on the ground, that's the accountability challenge, and not the volunteers that go and build schools. They can be a bit of an annoyance, but they won't create too much damage. Yeah.
One addition. Without disagreeing at all with the comments of my colleagues on voluntourism, and you need to know what you're doing if you're going out there to do something, I would never underestimate the impact on the Canadians who go there of what they learn and what they see and how it changes their view of the conditions in the rest of the world. And they may have done a lousy job of building the school, but boy, they're much better supporters of development in Canada when they come back than they were before they went.
As the director of the Institute for Safe International Development, I need to say one thing. We actively discourage what you call volunteerism. We've gotten all of the major student organizations to agree with us without arguing with them. And what we say to our students and what we try to do before they go is, this is a learning experience for you, a life experience. They come back as better advocates for development, but they also come back changed. They know the world. They're not insular, they're not parochial, and I think that's the key thing. For that reason, we train our students to be really what we hope to be citizens of the world, and we send them out. We tell them they don't get credit. We don't want them to go on these volunteerism things, and we tell them why. And, it usually works. The last thing I'll say, too, is that a lot of the discussions, including the idea of Canada's experience as a bilingual country, it shows that Canada can play a role in the world that doesn't cost a lot of money. in the sense that its ideas, its experiences, its models, is what work and unfortunately what doesn't work. We have corruption, as Charles said, but the way it's dealt with in Canada, that's something to learn from. However successful or unsuccessful it is, it's those processes, the idea of rule of law. And that's what's important, and I think that's the role that Canada can play much more fully. And certainly in the Cold War period, it tried to do that with probably, arguably, more success. So thank you for the questions, thank you for the panelists, and I think we're going to transit into the next section.